Okay, so moving on then, and our next major topic is navigating, right? Navigation to a selected record, especially with the details view control, okay? The grid view has its own ability to show multiple rows. It's pretty easy to find things usually in there, although this technique can be used with that as well. Although usually our filtering and so on helps us find things in the grid if we don't want to page through hundreds of pages, right? But with the details view, we only see one record at a time. Paging is certainly not very efficient, so we've got to be able to search for or select a specific record. Well, quite often then, a simple drop-down list is all we need. So we can pick the record we want, get some summary piece of information together that we can show in that drop-down, and away we go. So if we use a drop-down list populated from the same data source, then there's a real easy trick, right? It's incredibly easy to do it then. It's just not usually very practical. But I kind of like showing this just because it's a fun introduction to the concept. So just a little bit of code added allows us to do this quite simply. It only really works well if we have an order by clause in our select statement to begin with, right? But just to show you what we have to do then, okay, if we have our data source control to ordering the records, we add a drop-down list using the same data source, enable auto postback, and then in the selected index changed event handler, so whenever we pick a new item out of the drop-down list, all we do is we synchronize the details view's page index to the selected index in our drop-down. That will work logically because when we pick a record in the drop-down list, because the data is coming in the same order, right, as far as both are concerned, if I pick the 5th record, okay, then I can just immediately have the details view jump to the 5th record or 7th record or whatever, right? So it's a very simple approach, but it has some clear weaknesses. But let's do that first and just see how easy that is. So coming back here, right, we have our doctor's page, right? Why don't we, maybe above here, I'll just throw in a, I don't know, I should put a label probably, really. Get the toolbox up, throw a label in. Text is select doctor. And then beside the label, I'll just stick in a drop-down list, right? We'll choose the data source, the same data source. Here's another time I can use that doctor summary, right? I'll enable auto postback. Okay, I don't need to worry about adding an all option because this isn't really a filter. This is just a navigation, right? What I have to do though is add the selected index changed event. Notice by double clicking on it, it's another way to create an event handler. Which one? The default, right? There's always a default event handler, the most commonly used event handler. So the drop-down list one selected index change. Oh, bad, David. I didn't actually name my drop-down list. Should I go back? I guess I should. Okay. So I'll delete this chunk of code because I went too fast. Come back here. Need to do two things. First of all, come into the lightning bolt. If I select this by double-clicking, come on. Come on. My mouse is not behaving. Usually double-clicking this label will select it. Huh. There. I think that'll work. I just took it out, right? So that will take it out of the attributes as well. Okay. So now let me go back to the properties. I'll give it a good ID. DDL select doctor, something like that. Then come back here, recreate the event handler, and it uses the proper name for the control. Okay, so all I said I have to do here is I'll set the, have I named the details view? Oh, no, it's just details view 1. Bad, David. Oh, it's because I'm looking at events. DV doctors. Yep. Okay. Now, so DV doctors dot page index. So the page index is basically the index ID, or remember it counts as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 for each page, right? I'll just set that equal to my drop-down list. Selected doctor, selected index. And let's just see the effect of doing that as a navigation. So now I have my drop-down list here using that formal name, and that just instantly jumps to the appropriate doctor, right? Nice and easy. Problem is, this actually isn't, you know, a very good arrangement. Notice that it's not alphabetical, right? It's hard to, like if you had a large number, it's hard to jump in the list by typing the first letter. For one thing, they're all dr dot, right? So, you know, it's okay if you have a small number of records. Better than using the paging at the bottom, right? Because you can find it fairly easily. By the way, I can delete this one because there were no related children. If I delete this guy, I can't delete because there's patient assigned. Yeah, there's my database error handling working. Okay. So it kind of works, but it's really not great because, for one thing, this isn't in a very good arrangement and it's not alphabetically ordered, right? So usually what we end up doing is going to a separate data source to populate our navigation control. So we'll talk about doing that next. All right, stop running. So that kind of works, but, okay, what we really need then is a separate data source to give us our proper drop-down list, right? So when we have multiple DataBound controls, working the same data source, updates are automatic, okay? As soon as we don't, then we have an issue because updates done through one don't appear in the other, right? So let's get moving on my example. Perhaps I'll show the problem first, and then we'll have to look at the code we need to do to make it work. So instead, I'm going to add another data source here. This is the one for the actual details view itself, returning all the doctors. So let's add a data source. Give it an ID. Oh. Of DS doctor list. Following our approach to creating list style stored procedures and so on, right? So the doctor list data source, we'll configure it, use our same connection string. We'll do everything with stored procedures, but fortunately, when I go to the stored procedure list, I do have a doctor list stored procedure, right? Done in the same style we talked about last in the first half of the course. I don't need update, insert, or delete at all because it's just to give me data for my drop-down list, right? Test the query and we can see what it looks like. So this list style stored procedure should be alphabetically sorted. Notice it's been set up to use the formal name format, last name, comma, first name, right? So if you have 5 Smiths, then it'll be sorted by the first name, but at least you have the last name first, right? So it works very well for starting to type letters and jump in the drop-down list to the correct information. And the ID is just the primary key of the doctor. Okay, so that's good, right? So we'll set that as the data source here, right? Our doctor list data source, showing our display text and keeping the ID as the value, right? We don't need to have an all option here. It's not really a filter, right? It's just a navigation control. Enable auto postback is good, but we're going to want to get rid of that event handler that we added a minute ago, right? So maybe I'll do that first. Just select it, come over here to events. Delete this event handler and make sure I take it out of here as well. Since it doesn't want to let me select it all, I can do it this way. Okay. So how is it going to apply a filter now, right? Sure, it'll give me a drop-down list of doctors I can choose, but how is it going to actually filter? Well, what we need to do then is come back to the data source for the actual data we're working with for our details view. And instead of using the select all stored procedure, we're going to use a different stored procedure for the select. Right, so we can run this again. Instead of the doctor select all, doctor select by ID. Remember, that was one of the standard stored procedures. We said the first things you need is you always want to select all of the records and then zero in on one at a time as identified by the primary key, right? So that's how this one is set up. The same stored procedures for update, insert, and delete will work fine for their jobs, but now we're only ever going to select one at a time, right? But because there's a parameter in that stored procedure, selecting the doctor by ID, it's looking for, well, how are we going to get the ID? Well, that will come from a control. Which control? Our drop-down list, right? I don't even need to put a default value. That's not important because we don't have our all option anyway. I just click next. I can test the query, but I always have to provide a value for testing then, so I can guess 1, 2, or 3, right? And it should run and it'll return Dr. ID 1, okay? I could test it again, put it in a different value, but I'll only ever see a single doctor return. But that's okay, right? No problem. So now, okay, I have a better alphabetical display of the doctors, right? And it does work because it posts back immediately as soon as I select the doctor out of the list and applies the filter saying, details view only show me one doctor. I can edit the doctor. Notice that new still works. Okay, it brings up the blank form ready to insert a new doctor. No problem there. Let's test that it actually works. The new doc. Actually, I should put new in here. Right, I can insert that. Okay. Oh. Here's our first example then of the issue with having separate data source controls. Yes, our navigation works much better, but we modified the data in the database through one control with its data source, but this one relies on a different data source. So we have to tell it to get refreshed, right? If we want changes made here, even if I edit, right? If I edit Doogie R, maybe it's not R, it's Z, right? It still says Doogie R. It doesn't update, okay? We don't see the new one, we don't see changes made, and so on. So we have to get it to refresh this as well when changes are made here. So that's the exact issue we're talking about in our PowerPoint slide. Okay, so let's look at the solution then. What else do we have to do? Yep, we've done a better navigation, but, right? Okay, we need to write a little bit of code, okay? All we have to do is reassign, okay, the data source ID, right? So pick the DataBound control that we need to get refreshed. Whatever its data source ID is, just reassign the same value. That will force it to go out and ask for a fresh copy of the data. One line of code, Now the question is, where do we put that, right? Okay, so it could be that we've done different things, like in our details view, right? We might insert, we might update, we might delete, and so on. So rather than putting this code in each of those different after events, we can just use that common event, the command event, right? So in a grid view, it's the row command, and in a details view, it's item command. It's like our funnel, okay? All the commands go through there, okay? The other events all still hit this general command event. So in our details view, it's the item command event. That's the one we're going to use, right? In that event, we'll decide, okay? We can decide what to do depending on which command was just executed. Did we just insert, right? Then we have to do something different than if we just updated, for example, okay? Or vice versa. So we might end up with code that looks a bit like this. So we use the item command event of our details view. Notice it has this argument, a details view command event arg. Okay, this little E object in this case is of that type. So we can check the command name property, right? If it's insert or delete, then all we really want to do is update the data source. Tell it to refresh its data. The reason why I have an else if here is, what if we've just updated? Then it's a little disconcerting. Whenever we do this, okay, just reassign the data source, it'll go back to the first record, right? It'll always go back to the first record, which is fine when you're inserting or when you're deleting, okay? You don't expect to keep watching the same record. But if you're updating, say, Fred's information, right? When you're finished, you would expect to see Fred's record up there still, right? So you can see what change you just made. You don't want it to jump off and go back to the first record. So what we do then is, if the command name was update, we'll pull a little bit of a trick. We'll say, hey, guess what? I need to kind of put fold down the corner of the page, right? To put a bookmark in and remember what the selected value was of that particular record that I just edited, right? And then I'll refresh the data source and I'll move it back to that same bookmark, right? So we can easily do that just by remembering, since our values here are integers, primary keys, I can just use an integer as my sort of temporary memory storage here, my bookmark, right? So that's the basic idea of what we have to do. So again, it's our details view, right? The item command, so we go to the lightning bolts. Item command right at the top. I'll just double click. My details view doctor's item command. And you know, because I'm feeling lazy today, I'm even going to copy some of that code out of my PowerPoint slide, save a bit of time, and just modify it. Because most of it's pretty valid, right? So if the command name is insert or delete, then all we want to do is refresh. Now, of course, this isn't right. We have our DDL selected doctor, and the data source ID, well, that's the name. Now here, notice it's not giving me an error. Got to be careful, because this is a quotes around it. It's a string, right? So it's up to me. The IntelliSense can't tell me you got the wrong name here, dummy. Right? It's up to me to make sure I put the proper name. The data source for my drop-down list is my DS doctor list. Right? And that would cause it to refresh. Okay? However, if I've updated the record, then just a quick bit of copy replace here. I guess I could have done a search and replace all of it. Okay? So that my DDL selected doctor, the selected value can be stored in my integer. Oh. Okay. It's a string. All right. Then I'll update give this command to update the actual data source and refresh it. And then I'll set the selected value back again. I think that should work. Okay, so let's just test it out now. I might get an error because I didn't have the actual ASPX page in focus. No, it worked. Okay. So of course it refreshed because I stopped and started again, so I see my new doctor and so on. So I can still navigate, right, to any doctor by picking them out of the list. I will do an edit here on Charles Xavier. What was the initial I had there before? Did anyone remember? R. Okay. Click update. And there we go. You see it's immediately updated as well in the drop-down list, right? If I do another new, just type in a bit of garbage here, insert, then that new record is already in the list. So I've successfully refreshed the drop-down list, okay, with the changes made in the details view. If I delete the new doctor, then there it is, gone out of the list, right? Now let's try and edit those. So I'll pick somebody who's not at the, oh, I did that already. But just to show you that we do stay on the same record, right? So we're still looking at Gregory House, which is what you'd want the end user. They don't want to, in an edit, you want to see the result of your changes immediately, right? Rather than navigate back to the first record. Okay. So that's all there is really, but there's often situations where, okay, we end up having to use separate data sources, even though they're looking at basically the same data. So that's all there is to getting the synchronization going, so you can actually update and have the same information shown in all the controls. Back to the PowerPoint. Okay. You know what, before we get into bulletproofing, I think it's break time.